Editor, cue laugh track. No, wait, no, I'm the editor. Yeah, I'm not gonna do that. Dante broke... No. DE broke Warframe. If you haven't been keeping up to date with the Dante nerf / let's just make the Warframe bloody broken, it's truly entertaining. Okay, let me paint you a story. Dante comes out. At the same time, DE also releases a rework for Inaros, and they also release an augment for Chroma. Basically, these two things mean that people want to play Inaros and Chroma again. Also, Nidus is just a relatively popular frame anyway. Chroma needs to take health damage to get damage buff from Vex armor. And Nidus and Inaros is commonplace to put Rage or Hunter Adrenaline on for energy economy. Dante came out and he gives Warframes Overguard. He was showing up in missions, public matches all over the place because he was just released and he was a really good Warframe, so people really enjoyed him. People asked DE to come up with a way to make things like Vex Armor and Hunter Adrenaline and Rage work with Overguard. Vex Armor and Rage / Hunter Adrenaline are old stuff. You shouldn't nerf new stuff when old stuff is no longer good to lower them to the level of the old stuff. You should buff the old stuff to make it as good as the new stuff, which is actually what DE is finally doing. But not until nerfing Dante, and not until nerfing actually quite a few other Warframes as well. It's so bad. Okay, so DE is presented with people asking them to either make Rage and Hunter Adrenaline and Vex Armor work with Overguard, or stop Dante from giving allies Overguard. That's what people asked. That is the only thing people asked. DE's response: we're gonna change it so you only get half the amount of Overguard from Lightverse and Tragedy for both Dante and allies. What they should have done was they kept Dante the same and then halved it for allies, like how Styanax's augment works. That makes sense. But no, they decided they would do it for both. But then they backtracked and they made it so that it isn't quite half. It's still lower than what it was originally, but it's more than what it was after the first nerf. However, in doing this, they also doubled the amount of Overguard you get when your Overguard regenerates when you kill enemies. And the actual number of Overguard you got from Triumph wasn't what made Dante good. What made Dante good was the fact that Overguard regeneration makes you invincible. So they actually technically buffed Dante's Overguard when they were trying to nerf it. Make it make sense. That's the first thing. The second one, and the worst one, is the changes they made to Tragedy. So, Tragedy, they made Line of Sight. Why is this an issue? Well, Line of Sight is incredibly inconsistent across all Warframes in the entire game, and has often been reviewed with a lot of distrust. The community has never liked it when Warframe has used Line of Sight for AoE ability DPS abilities like Tragedy. So immediately, the community responds to this, and I kid you not, like pretty much 90% of the replies to the forum post where DE announced the changes they made to Dante was, these are terrible changes, revert the changes, we never asked for Line of Sight on Tragedy, why would you do this, revert the changes, Line of Sight sucks, revert the changes, all you needed to do was make Overguard half for allies, revert the changes, like literally just over and over and over again, people asking for DE to revert the changes and make Dante no longer have a Line of Sight check because it made Tragedy incredibly inconsistent. What did DE do? They apologize. They say, we are sorry for the way the Line of Sight checks on Dante was shipped, and we're gonna do a complete review on the way Line of Sight works on all Warframes. This could actually be a good thing, as it means if they achieve it well, they could fix an incredibly inconsistent thing that is in their game. So they update a patch and they change it. And one of the things they say, okay, we believe this is going to make line of sight much better. And they do this basically right before they close shop for the weekend. Except they released this patch that didn't just affect Dante, but it affected all Warframes that have line of sight, all line of sight abilities, like Darkverse, which was line of sight from his original release. It was never not line of sight. So Darkverse, it got changed as well with this change. Korra got changed, Amber got changed, any other ability with a line of sight got changed. So it is now even more inconsistent, as your own player character can stop line of sight from happening. This means that if an enemy is right in front of you, the ability won't work on them because the game thinks it's not in the line of sight because your character is blocking them. And it's not just tragedy. It's Darkverse, it's every line of sight ability in the game. And DE did this, and then they said, okay, we're done for the weekend, and we hope you enjoy your weekend. Goodbye, folks. And look, I get it. I'm not faulting them for having a weekend. They're allowed to have a weekend. It is unrealistic to expect them to give up their weekend to work overtime to fix the game. That's fine. What they shouldn't have done was made a nerf straight before the weekend. What they shouldn't have done was nerfed a brand new Warframe. And what they shouldn't have done was gave out a fix to line of sight without clearly testing it, because if they spent like 20 minutes testing it, they would have realized that the player character blocks the line of sight check. That's what they shouldn't have done. They should have waited till Monday to further address the issue before breaking their game and then going away for the weekend. It's actually hilarious. But we're gonna also talk about not just what actually got nerfed, which I just covered, and how it is ridiculous how DE is apparently refusing to revert their changes, even though the entire community basically is asking them to do it, but instead they're focused on making line of sight better, which, to be honest, could actually prove to be a good thing. I think that's hilarious. That they're just apparently ignoring the multiple comments, 90% of the comments that are saying revert the changes. But I actually want to go into detail about how his changes affect his kit from a gameplay perspective. So, first of all, Word Warden actually got buffed. It went from 30% to 50%. That's great. I actually want to see Word Warden to be further buffed, so the Canticle mods work on it. What I mean by this is if Word Warden, if you mod a Canticle mod on your Noctura, and then Word Warden hits an enemy, and then you then kill that enemy with a DPS or another weapon, it would proc the Canticle mods, like the extra universal orb drops, or the extra fire rate, or the shield recharge delay, all that stuff. That would make this ability a lot more, give a lot more utility, and make Dante a much better support. Because let's be real, Dante actually isn't a good support. All he does is give you overguard. There are other frames that do that. Stynax gives you overguard, shields, regen, and if you're using RachoFire, a viral buff as well. Like, he's actually not that good of a support frame, and doing this change to Word Warden would make him much better at support and just greatly improve this ability as a whole. Page Flight also got nerfed. They got rid of the damage vulnerability to status effects on enemies tagged by Page Flight. So if you're not sure, the way Page Flight works is that it basically makes it so that any enemies that are tagged by it have an increased chance to be affected by a status effect. This means that it basically will increase the status chance of your weapon when you hit an enemy tagged by it. But it also, and DE says this was unintentional, it also actually increased the damage the status effects were doing on those enemies, which synergized really well with Tragedy and made it do some really crazy damage numbers. Now, DE says this was intentional and they were just getting rid of it as it was basically a bug. And I am not upset by that because if it's a bug, it's a bug. Like, that's cool. But DE has actually already come back and said, we've seen that a lot of people were disappointed that they got rid of it. It was unintentional, but people want it back, so we are going to clean it up and bring it back and make it an official part of Dante's kit, which I think is great, because not only is it good for Tragedy itself, but you can definitely play around with that with other builds and potentially makes a lot of build diversity for Dante that no other Warframe can do, as it is a unique effect, unique to Dante, which is Really cool. So I think it's good they're bringing that back. The Overguard, they basically just lowered the amount of Overguard you get per cast. You can still spam the abilities and get your Overguard up pretty quickly, and they doubled the amount of Overguard you get from the Overguard regen. So all in all, this actually isn't really a big issue, even in the slightest. The issue with the nerf is that's not what the community asked for, and it is an arbitrary nerf that was made without any real thought or concern. People asked for you to fix the way Rage, Hunter Adrenaline, and Vex Armor worked with Overguard, and simply lowering the amount of Overguard you give allies doesn't do that. And no one actually wanted you to lower the Overguard. Like, we were fine with the Overguard. We just wanted these mods / abilities to work with Overguard. So the nerf is just not what we wanted. Like, it isn't actually that bad of a nerf, and it ultimately won't affect your gameplay, like, at all. It's just not what people wanted. And obviously people are upset because they just feel like it's unjustified, which I totally understand. The Tragedy nerf is the biggest nerf because it's just inconsistent, and it is making Dante worse than what he was because of the inconsistency. But assuming that they keep line of sight on Tragedy, but they manage to make it consistent, not only will that actually make a lot of other Warframes better that also already had line of sight, I actually don't see this as big of an issue, as Tragedy only works on enemies with status effects on them, meaning somebody needs to apply a status effect on them. So if you're playing solo, if you're using Dark first to apply status effects, which is the main way you do it, the ability was already line of sight because Dark Verse was line of sight from the get-go, and Dark Verse was also directional. So although Tragedy itself didn't have a line of sight, you were applying the status effects with a line of sight condition anyway, and it only worked enemies that were affected by that line of sight condition ability, so it was indirectly already line of sight. Or, if you didn't want to use Dark Verse, you could use a weapon, which, unless you mod for Punch Through, is also line of sight. So, Tragedy indirectly was already line of sight because the only way to apply status effects was with line of sight. Now, you could have used Melee Influence to apply status effects in a full 360 in different rooms even, and avoid that line of sight check when it comes to status effects, which would be the best way to make the most use out of Tragedy, which unfortunately you can no longer use, because you used to be able to do that to wipe out enemies that were in a different room from you. Also, if you were playing with teammates, your teammates could have been in a different room, but still within range of Tragedy, and applying status effects on enemies with their weapons or abilities, and then Tragedy would have been able to kill those enemies as well. But when it comes to solo, unless you were using Melee Influence, it would have been line of sight anyway, just indirectly, so it isn't really that big of a change. Yes, it sucks we can't use Melee Influence. Yes, it sucks you can't make use of other allies also applying status effects. But it doesn't change Dante that badly. Like, he still works. It's inconsistent right now, and that should be fixed. And if that means changing it to not be line of sight anymore, then that's what needs to happen. But if they manage to make line of sight work, then, and Tragedy becomes consistent again, then I don't see line of sight being an issue. That said, it was still a completely unjustified nerf, as no one asked for them to make it this way. Furthermore, basically every other nuking ability in the game isn't line of sight. Spores isn't line of sight. I don't think Miasma is. It might be, but I'm pretty sure it's not. Equinox isn't line of sight. Volt's Forth isn't line of sight. Thermal Sunder isn't line of sight. These abilities aren't affected by this line of sight restriction, so why on earth should Dante? And before you say, oh, well, Equinox may have a large range, but, like, you have to have more setup. You needed setup with Dante. You couldn't just activate Tragedy and expect it to work. It only works on enemies affected by status effects. Like, you need to have a second step there. You were either using a directional weapon or Dark Verse, which is directional and line of sight anyway, or you were using Melee Influence. You couldn't just double tap 3 and then tap 4, and then every enemy would be killing you without thinking about it. Like, it still had restrictions. It wasn't overpowered, and there are many nuking abilities that are far more powerful than it. Look at Nej's ability. Yes, Nej's augment got nerfed, so it's half range. I haven't tried it out yet. I do think half is a bit much. 75% of the range would have been probably better. But, like, look at what Nej's was beforehand. Like, that wasn't line of sight. It was nuking maps. What about Dual Ica with Melee Influence on Seren? literally nukes a map with just a few melee clicks. It is a completely arbitrary decision that tragedy should be line of sight, while all these other non-line of sight effects that were honestly better than tragedy to begin with aren't changed. It makes no sense, and it should be changed. It doesn't affect me that badly, and I don't think tragedy would be a bad ability if the line of sight stays, assuming it would be made consistent. But at the end of the day, the community wants it to be reverted back so it's not line of sight. This is a PvE game, and it's a power fantasy game. Unless something is overly dominant to the point where Dante becomes the only Warframe being played, which isn't happening, and even if it was happening, a few days after release is not a reliable source of information to gauge on how dominant he would be, because of course he would be more popular after his release. It makes no sense to arbitrarily nerf it. If people want it to be more powerful, it should be more powerful. That's the point of the game. It is a power fantasy. If it was a PvP game where different character balancing mattered more because one character would be just so dominant and so much powerful that playing another character would be unfair, then yes, you can make the argument that tragedy or a few other things in the game should be nerfed. But that's not the way Warframe works. It's PvP, PvE. It doesn't matter if one Warframe is much more powerful than another Warframe. Warframe should still be buffed to be brought up to the level of Warframes like Dante and Sarah and Octavia, Gauss, all these other Warframes. But like, it doesn't matter if they're much more powerful because it's PvP. At the end of the day, if you walk out of the room and you did 50% of the damage in a mission with a full public squad, it doesn't affect anyone. You don't get a reward, you don't get any special bonuses, nothing happens. It's just a number. Sure, it can boost your ego, but besides that, it means nothing. And the game is literally a power fantasy. And this is something that DE say themselves. They say it is a power fantasy game. If people are asking for a specific power fantasy, why aren't you giving it to them? The entire community is asking you to revert the new changes. So just do it. Literally just do it. You could make it so allies get half the overguard, or you can even keep the overguard at what it is. I was playing Dante and I honestly didn't see any issues now that they've changed the overguard a second time. But like, the big issue was the way Hunter Adrenaline, Rage, and Vex Armor works, and they've already announced ways of how they're going to fix it to make it work with Overguard, which is great, because guess what? Vex Armor sucked, and now Vex Armor is finally getting a buff, which it needed for years. That's what should have happened when this conversation started in the first place, instead of unnecessarily nerfing Dante, which wasn't even that powerful compared to other Warframes. He was just a good Warframe that was being compared to terrible Warframes. When comparing a good and a bad thing, the bad thing should be buffed to made better. The good thing shouldn't be nerfed to made worse, to be put on the level of the bad thing. That's just reverse thinking. And it doesn't make any sense. And if this update proved anything, that's how you make your community turn on you. Because the community is absolutely livid. And they are demanding for the changes to be reverted. So why don't you just revert it? Anyway, that's all I have to say about Dante's changes and the way he works. He still works fine. Like, he's not a terrible Warframe. He's not broken. He is inconsistent now, but he still works fine. The big reason and the big issue with these nerfs is it just was an unnecessary thing that never needed to happen, and it just feels bad more than anything. But he still works fine, and he's still definitely worth picking up if you want to play him. But if you like this video, do please check out some of my other videos. Check out my other YouTube channel where I just post Let's Play videos. Check out my Instagram, my TikTok, where I post posts about my Warframe YouTube channel, all that stuff. Check out my Discord, my Warframe Discord. It's for a clan. You can ask for a clan invite there, or you can just hang out with some cool people. Check out all that stuff, and until next time, bye-bye.